what if watching this video is already part of the problem? Not slightly, structurally. Your brain is designed to seek low-effort rewards, scrolling, browsing, watching something interesting. All of it releases dopamine with almost no friction. And consuming content about discipline, learning about habit loops, environment design, the 4 laws of behavior change, feels productive. It feels like work. It produces a real sense of forward momentum. But the neuroscience says something uncomfortable. The brain that processed this video has experienced almost exactly the same reward cycle as the brain that watched a 30-second clip of a cat. That detail changes what this video actually needs to be. The neuroscience behind discipline is largely correct and increasingly well known. The human brain evolved for immediate survival and energy conservation, not for long-term goal pursuit. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes under fatigue. Dopamine, contrary to popular belief, is not a pleasure chemical but an anticipation chemical. It spikes at the promise of reward, which is why the next scroll is always more compelling than the current one. James Clear, whose framework runs beneath most of this content, puts the core insight plainly. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. The research also confirms that environment design shapes behavior more powerfully than motivation. A single repositioning of water bottles in a cafeteria increased consumption measurably, with zero motivational messaging. What is most accessible is most likely to be done. All of this is verified. All of it matters. But here's what almost no one in this genre stops to acknowledge. The entire ecosystem delivering this information, the videos, the books, the podcasts, the productivity apps, is itself algorithmically optimized to be exactly what the content is warning you against. Low friction, high dopamine, endlessly consumable. You can spend an entire afternoon learning about discipline without ever enacting any of it. And your brain, having released a satisfying amount of dopamine across that afternoon, will feel like you made progress. Everything seemed like a genuine solution, until you ask what's happening in the brain of the person watching. Here's the first thing the research actually says, that discipline content almost never applies to itself. Dopamine downregulation is real. When the brain receives repeated easy stimulation, scrolling, watching, browsing, the dopamine receptors responsible for registering satisfaction gradually reduce in sensitivity. The effect is direct tolerance. You need more stimulation to feel the same level of reward. Tasks that require sustained attention start to feel genuinely punishing. By contrast, not because they've changed, but because the brain's baseline has shifted upward. This is the mechanism that makes real work feel impossible after a long browsing session. Now apply that mechanism to the content itself. Not effort, relief. Not progress, resolution. Not doing, understanding. The brain registers understanding as a form of completion. When you understand why you've been struggling with discipline, when the neuroscience clicks into place and suddenly your failure has a name, a mechanism, a framework, that understanding produces a real feeling of arrival, a small but genuine sense that something has been addressed. And in that feeling, the urgency to change drops slightly. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological one. And it's the same mechanism the content is describing, working now on the content itself. But here is where the story takes a darker turn, because this loop is not accidental, and it's not neutral. Ask yourself this: if the self-improvement industry's goal were for people to permanently solve their discipline problems, what would its business model look like? A person who builds a functioning system, stops struggling with procrastination, and no longer needs motivational content, has exited the market entirely. The ideal customer, the one who generates ongoing revenue from books, courses, apps, and videos, is someone who cycles through frameworks, makes partial progress, feels close to a breakthrough, and returns for the next thing. The advice is real. The loop it creates is also real. Every video about dopamine detox delivered through the same app that engineered your dopamine dependency. Every book about building systems sold through a platform algorithmically designed to make you browse for 2 hours. Every podcast about focus consumed in the background while the brain does something else. The system that sells you the map to escape also owns the road you'd have to walk to get there. You cannot consume your way out of a consumption problem. And you cannot build discipline by repeatedly understanding why you lack it. This doesn't mean the frameworks are wrong. Environment design genuinely works. Habit stacking genuinely reduces friction. The 4 laws of behavior change are grounded in solid behavioral research. The nucleus accumbens really does run on dopamine anticipation rather than pleasure receipt. The knowledge is accurate. The delivery mechanism is compromised. Stay with me, because what comes next is the only part of this conversation that actually changes anything. Here's the truth underneath every piece of discipline content ever made, including this one. The world was told that understanding the problem is the first step towards solving it. The neuroscience says something more precise. Understanding the problem can substitute for solving it. And that substitution is almost impossible to feel from the inside because it feels exactly like the first step. The world calls this learning. Behavioral science calls it pseudo-work, effortful-seeming activity that generates the internal feeling of progress without producing any behavioral output. The brain doesn't care which category it falls into. The actual intervention is not more information. It is a single structural change made before the next moment of low resistance. One environment altered, one habit anchored to one existing trigger, one distraction removed with friction rather than willpower. Not a framework fully understood. One action taken once before the urge to consume more content re-emerges. Knowing the path is not the same as walking it, and the feeling that they are the same is the most comfortable trap in modern life. This is not a story about YouTube videos or productivity apps. It is a story about what happens when an entire culture becomes skilled at performing growth without experiencing it. The same pattern runs through wellness content, financial education, mental health awareness, genuine knowledge, delivered through systems engineered to produce repeated consumption rather than behavioral change. Understanding trauma, understanding burnout, understanding bias, all of it real. All of it potentially looping into a substitute for the harder work each topic demands. The most useful thing you can do with anything you've understood in the last 10 minutes is close this and do exactly one thing you've been avoiding. Not because understanding is useless, because understanding, at the point where it begins substituting for action, has become its own form of distraction. Most people will keep consuming. Now you know what that costs.